Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Chubby, and today I'm here with Professor Kyle Ganson, and we're going to talk about their research in Eat More Protein, Build More Muscle, a grounded theory study of muscle building behaviours among Canadian adolescents and young adults. Kyle Ganson is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. His research focuses on eating disorders, muscle dysmorphia, and muscle building behaviours among adolescents and young adults, particularly boys and young men. Dr. Ganson is the principal investigator of the Canadian Study of Adolescent Health Behaviours, a national longitudinal study of health behaviours, including eating disorders and muscle building behaviours, amongst Canadian adolescents and young adults across all 13 provinces and territories in Canada, and has published over 125 peer-reviewed academic papers in leading adolescent health, eating disorder, body image, and substance use journals. He has over 10 years of direct clinical social work practice experience, and he teaches clinical social work courses to Master of Social Work students. Today, we're here to discuss his article, Eat More Protein, Build More Muscle, a grounded theory study of muscle building behaviors among Canadian adolescents and young adults. Without further ado, Kyle, welcome to Curious Campus.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Really excited for the conversation we're about to have.
Yeah, me too.
So, to get us started, curious about how you came into your specific research topics, specifically of like eating disorders, muscle dysmorphia, and such.
So yeah, I'm a clinical social worker by training, so I've done a lot of work in the field. I'm actually from the US, so I came to Canada when I got my academic appointment in 2020, but prior to that I was in the US doing clinical work and had private practice. I worked in different clinical settings like residential treatment, outpatient, day treatment, as well as I did some work in like emergency settings as well. And most of my work in those settings focused on disorder eating, eating disorder treatment. I'm working a lot with adolescents and adults, not surprisingly in the settings that I was in, treating people with eating disorders way back in, I don't know, I think it was probably 2015. That was a time kind of pre, which is kind of sad to say, like pre kind of opening doors for men and even really trans folks to be a part of treatment programs. A lot of them were female only. And so as a male clinician working in an eating disorder space that was very dominated by females, not only clientele, but the like practitioners and the staff were all female typically. I often thought a lot about like what was my role in that space as a male, and also like where were all the other males? Where were they? Obviously, they're not immune to these types of issues around body image or disordered eating or desires to change their body in a particular way. Kind of, I did a lot of my research early on, sort of focused specifically on like eating disorders in a typical sense among males and sort of characterizing that, which naturally led to more muscularity oriented concerns and muscle building behaviors because that is typically kind of a behavioral phenomenon, a weight and shape concern among this population. So it really like grew out of the clinical work that I was doing and just sort of the gaps that we were seeing. And we continue to see in treatment settings for treating body image and eating disorders among male populations.
Mm-hmm. And was the focus on particularly like adolescents also from a gap that you were seeing within that social work?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There are also gaps around eating disorder work across the lifespan. There are
Mm-hmm.
some emerging data, and maybe it's not so emerging anymore. I think it's kind of well founded at this point that like people of middle age and kind of adulthood experience disordered eating and body image concerns as they go through various transitions in their life, whether it be parenthood, whether it be body changes through menopause, or deterioration of muscle mass among men because of lower testosterone levels as people age. That does create body image concerns and potentially eating disorders or disordered eating behaviors. But we know that just generally the stats kind of show that, onset happens typically around anywhere between 16 to 25 years old with like maybe a mean age of 19 to 20 for eating disorders. Most eating disorders do onset around that time. So definitely the adolescent time frame is a particularly high risk area and developmental time. And most people, if they're going to experience an eating disorder, do typically experience an eating disorder by the age of 40. So, it's gonna be typically on the sort of younger age time frame. And of course, adolescents are just primed for all types of different mental health conditions, substance use. There's lots of social change happening. We see that ever more so today with social media. So they're, I hate the term at risk, but they're a particular at risk group, given kind of lots of biopsychosocial cultural aspects.
Mm-hmm. So the paper that we're talking about focuses, I guess, like mostly on muscle building exercises and other physical constraints. So do you like go into the research because you've talked a lot about your work with eating disorders and such, do you go into that thinking about like that context, or is it easy, I guess, to keep like a more open mind about like the other possible reasons of youth going into that path?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I'll say just from kind of give some history about how this study came of be to be. It was kind of born out of the idea of trying to identify kind of what is a process theory of how people engage in muscle building behaviors. And I'm to define muscle building behaviors, I'm kind of using that as a pretty big umbrella. So that could include things as simple as just going and exercising at the gym, lifting weights, trying to maybe build some muscle mass and strength, all the way up to steroid use. So that would obviously be a bit more extreme in some opinions, right? That would be more extreme muscle building behavior. But, oftentimes it includes lots of things like dietary changes. So eating more protein, changing different macronutrients and tracking macronutrients or calories. It could also be the use of dietary supplements like whey protein, creatine, etc. It could be changing dietary practices like, bulking and cutting, where you're oscillating between a period of caloric surplus in order to build muscle mass, and then, going to a cutting phase, which is a caloric deficit, where you're trying to keep as much muscle mass as possible, but reduce the body fat you might have gained during that like bulking phase. So you kind of hopefully can have more musculature and sort of definition. So, I was really trying to focus on just what is the process that people actually go through from like the start, and not really even the finish, because it really typically for these people wasn't really a finish line, but it was more just how do things start, how do things evolve, and kind of what happens from there. So that's kind of how the study sort of started. And I think we generally have some good theories and understandings of how disordered eating, in a traditional sense, like fitness-oriented disordered eating, like restriction or binging and purging, compulsive exercise, diet, use of diuretics, things of that nature, kind of evolve from different, pressures and how that leads to dissatisfaction, et cetera. But I wanted to really understand like what, how do we identify this as a behavior? How do we understand it in like a process-oriented sort of perspective? And so that's how the study came to be. Yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And so it wasn't necessarily so much about a gap there was a gap in the literature that we didn't have that, but it wasn't something I was particularly seeing in, say, clinical practice. But I think identifying what the process orientation is around these behaviors could be mechanisms for maybe prevention, could be mechanisms for intervention. Identifying those different spaces would be important for, helping people on the ground, if you will.
So you talk a lot about this use of supplements and such that you've seen like use to help with this process that as they're going through muscle building and other just general like physical activities that they wish to do. So because that is in some sort of consumption, is there like a category for that within like eating disorders, because it's not necessarily what one would think of as like purely healthy food, like if you eat this on your own like you'll be good, or is there a difference?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think one of the reasons also this study came to be was to try and figure out, what is the line between problematic and not problematic and problematic engagement in muscle building behaviors. And so certainly, yes, supplement use was very common among the sample. It's actually really common among people, like in general, like it's like a multi-hundred plus billion-dollar industry, the supplement industry. It's a massive industry and a lot of people are using them. And we've collected data on, kind of prevalence of use among Canadian young people and young males. Like 80% of them have used whey protein in the past 12 months. So like that's a pretty high percentage of people who are interested in this type of products. But there's no like, you don't fit that into like a diagnostic criteria, let's say in the DSM-5, for example. Like there's no DSM-5 criteria of like supplement use, for example. But it is a behavioral phenomenon of people using these for oftentimes like aesthetic purposes, right? Like these products are marketed to tell people if you use whey protein, it might support a specific goal. I'm oversimplifying, right? But it might support the goal of trying to build more muscle or trying to become stronger or to recover faster, like have your body recover faster to be able to kind of perform it up, more optimally the next day, for example. Because it's a behavioral phenomenon attached to the desire to change one's body, oftentimes to fit an ideal within a culture that's oftentimes very, very hard to actually achieve. People go to extreme lengths in order to achieve that body ideal. It may experience significant distress as it relates to not fitting that body ideal, may experience significant issues in their social life, their academic, their occupational life, there's lots of different aspects of their life, their mental health, because they're maybe more preoccupied or obsessed with this desire to change their body in a particular way. So it's wrapped up in this notion and this desire to change one's body to fit the ideal. And for a long time, we've talked about body image and eating disorders. We often think specifically about females, which rightfully so. There's a lot of issues among females as it relates to body image and disordered eating and all that. However, this is the research that really talks more about the sort of male components of body image, which really ties to muscularity and really ties to the desire to increase muscle mass and strength, or leanness, right? Being lean, being toned, being perceived as muscular, even though one might actually not be as strong as the next person next to them. They might look more muscular. They have six-pack abs, they have defined chest and pectoral and biceps, etc., broad shoulders. That's obviously the ideal for the male body. So these behaviors kind of are an attempt to achieve that body.
Also, what is the DSM-5?
Sure, sorry. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the most recent edition of, the kind of classification of various mental health issues, as simple as depression, all the way up to learning disabilities, to eating disorders, etc.
Okay, I'm curious about that. So you talk about this body ideal that a lot of the participants that you've seen like throughout the study were like interested in becoming, and that's kind of like why they got interested in muscle building as well. But throughout the paper, like there's also this like concept of a lot of interview participants like mentioned considered more healthy outcomes that they wanted, which was like including like good sleep and a balance of mood, so like less depression and things. So I'm curious about like what you've learned from this because again, like talking about the negative things that you've seen and have talked about, does this like notion of a body ideal like also help guide youth in this particular case, I guess, to focusing on a starting point towards like health goals that would be considered healthy in the long run?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that, physical exercise, weight training, all that stuff is like immensely helpful for people, mental health, physical health, those types of things. Like, so there's the point of the study isn't necessarily to say you shouldn't do those things. I mean, it's more about understanding nuances of experience. This is sort of what phases in the process was trying to understand is kind of what is the process that takes someone from like, you know what, I'm going to go to the gym and try and build some muscle and get into shape. It's January 1st. Like, here's my New Year's resolution to like a pretty sort of like a simple, quote unquote, simple goal in doing that to all the, like I said, all the way up to sort of using steroids, which becomes a different, ball game, right? It's a really different ball game than just going to the gym and lifting weights a couple times a week, which would be like the recommended guidance, right? Like you should do a certain, I think it's about 2 to 3 days of weight training a week for most adults, something along those lines. So like I think that's kind of the nuance. And again, because I think the more, and this is sort of I think what the research says is that the more ingrained you become in the community, certainly this was an experience I think from our participants, like the more you became ingrained in the community, the more you sort of actually experienced the challenge of muscle building and how challenging that can be, that it takes time, it takes consistency, there's persistence, that you actually reach a point sometimes where like you don't gain any more muscle, like your body's like, no, this is actually the best I can do because this is my bone structure and this is kind of how I'm going to do it. That does sometimes create issues around like body dysmorphia or body dissatisfaction because they're not reaching the goals that they initially had or want, which again could up the ante of different behaviors like substance use, for example, or just becoming more obsessive with the behaviors like exercising more days a week, or maybe even like paying a coach to train you, which again, not necessarily bad or problematic, but just more investment goes into this process, which again, that's I think where some of the more potential adverse outcomes can come. That so in my mind, that's kind of one of the markers of sort of where it becomes more problematic is when you are doing this really guided by this body ideal, right? And like trying to achieve that body ideal, and then also to maybe stave off anxiety or dissatisfaction with one's own body by obsessively engaging in these behaviors and then losing out on different functional aspects of one's life, whether that be social aspects, occupational aspects, educational aspects, etc. Those would be kind of, I think, the lines where things become a bit more problematic. But certainly going to the gym and exercising and having positive effects like, yeah, maybe your clothes feel better on you, maybe you feel stronger. Like one of the participants I remember talked about like, able to carry their groceries like without needing more help, like those are all really positive benefits that I think are totally, acceptable and people should experience for sure.
So you talked a bit about this, about like this sort of blurry line that's there between like considering what's like healthy and not healthy. Could you like talk more about that on like what you found from these responses about whether there was like a clear way to, maybe not a lot of people said, but some people said that was like this might be like leaning on more unhealthy and it could lead down to further problems, especially from your experience in that social workspace prior.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's a lot of the things I kind of mentioned. It was the experience of people. just needing to sort of, or not feeling good enough because they weren't able to sort of reach a particular strength or definition or kind of body ideal that they had in their mind. And again, that's probably very much likely due to just simple genetics, that like the ideals we have for men and women are oftentimes, like I said, very unattainable, or if they are attainable, they're extremely hard to maintain. So like, yes, someone might be able to achieve a certain level of muscularity to present as that muscular ideal and that male ideal, but can they maintain that for 10 years? Like, probably not without having some potential like mental health or, physical health struggles. So I think that was kind of the main component of it was just when people started to sort of reach, like a lot of people talked about, when, and this is very much like born in just evidence, right? Like when you go to the gym and you start working out, like people do experience like kind of initial boosts in their strength, right? They might actually feel like stronger in their day-to-day life, like a very marked difference from just a few weeks or a couple months of weight training and changing some maybe dietary practices. Um, but then eventually your body kind of plateaus. Like you can, like I mentioned before, like everybody kind of has what's called like a genetic max in this community where like you just like certain bodies can just hold more muscle mass because of the different structures of their bones or just the amount of hormones in their bodies or whatever. And so once you hit that genetic max, I think a lot of people see a plateauing that happens. And so that creates some maybe dissatisfaction. It also maybe, like I mentioned, creates some desire to up the ante, right? They might work out more days a week. They might pay for a trainer. They might consider using, steroids or another, drug that will help them with their muscle building goals. And again, that's where that body dysmorphia might come into play. Like why, in comparison, why is this person able to do it, but I can't? So I think those would be like kind of the main markers of where the line becomes a bit more blurry and how it becomes a problem for people.
And I think it's cool that you mentioned all of these things about like people comparing with each other, especially like I guess like when at the gym when they're like doing these activities and they see other people like doing the same or possibly more and they're looking quite different from them. And like all of this information about like what is considered ideal and what the right way to go about this process is as an individual, like all of these like informal sources, I would say, like including through social media and such. Like, do you see there's like a difference in how, or did you find that there's a difference in how these youth approach their techniques and their processes and increase their persistence perhaps versus those who, as you mentioned, like talking about your growth being plateaued, like that might be like really come from like reading or like looking at a more like medical journal like talking about such a thing. So is there like a difference in whether youth get like a lot of their information from informal versus formal sources?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, from this study and from other studies I've done looking at, like use of like dietary supplements as well. It's hard to say and like draw a direct comparison. Like, does a person who like goes to a medical journal and like a personal trainer, for example, like have more growth, muscle growth, let's say, than a person who like goes to YouTube and follows like an influencer? I'm not sure about. That actually would be kind of an interesting study to look at. But what I can say is, I think most people did typically rely more heavily on informal sources, whether that be just like how they were introduced to the process, like possibly by like a partner or a friend, kind of introducing them to like, hey, this is kind of how muscle building works. This is the type of workout you could do. Let me come with you and show you. So that like hand holding, I think, was often very kind of personal for a lot of people in our study. But then, when people did start to get oriented to the community, the muscle building community, like that's when, they started following things on Instagram, right? And we know that, like once you start following like once you search a hashtag or once you look up a person, like all of a sudden your feed gets inundated with that type of information, right? Those types of videos, that type of advice. And so I think most people typically relied heavily on those informal sources. And I'm using them saying informal sources because they're people on YouTube. They may be qualified in some capacity to talk about some of these things or give advice, but it's that more like publicly available type of information that again might be 100% accurate, but it also it might also be guided by profits, right? That they might be trying to sell a product or they might be trying to get subscribers or they might just be trying to get views in order to sort of make money as an influencer in some capacity. So to answer your question, yeah, I don't think we have like the data truly on like the comparisons, but I think generally what I've seen is the informal sources are quite common. And I will say that a lot of those informal sources are really important in the sense that, like, for example, for steroid users, which again, we had a few steroid users in our sample. I think there was like three or four who had used in the past or recent past or had continued or were using currently. And actually, there's a lot of sharing of information around steroids and steroid use that actually can be very helpful for people in the sense that it reduces potential harms that people experience, like maybe gives advice about how to manage different side effects, things of that nature, which most steroid users are not willing to go and talk to their doctor about this stuff because they feel like they're going to be stigmatized or potentially like get in trouble or something along those lines. So those types of informal sources actually can be quite beneficial and very helpful in reducing, risk, whereas like other informal sources might actually proliferate the engagement in riskier behaviors, potentially problematic like dietary practices, overtraining, things of that nature. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of nuance in all this, and obviously is very relevant given the the social media climate we live in today.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. Like this notion about it just about who you choose within your community, especially because like it's obviously like these informal sources are very accessible and that's why they're used so much. And at the end of the day, that's how it's matters.
Absolutely, 100%.
So finally getting to the process theory then. So how did you figure out like the phases on this and like I guess like it could be generalized to like the 30 odd participants in this that you thought worked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, so it was just kind of, this was a grounded theory study. So that included, interviewing participants, just about their experience. Questions I had really were focused on historical context, which actually was one of the themes, but like was really about like, tell me about yourself, tell me like about who you are, what are your likes, really trying to understand the type of person that I was talking to. And then it was kind of going through like, okay, so when did you start, sort of, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but like, when did you start to engage in this type of stuff? Who influenced your behaviors? Kind of, what are you doing now? What have you changed in your behaviors? What do you think you'll do in the future? What kind of adverse or positive effects have you had from these behaviors? I did ask questions about like how did they gather information about these topics. So, a lot of it just came from having the conversation with people to really understand like what was the process they went through and how did they engage in these behaviors, which really, of course, like led to the kind of the coding and the analysis of trying to sort of pinpoint, kind of how do we sort of make this a semi-linear process. Like, I mean, I guess it's displayed a bit linearly in the figure in the manuscript, and I think there is some true linearity to it. Like, I don't think you just go right to more of like that preservation phase or intensification phase where you're like, maintaining or trying to amplify your body in some particular way in a more extreme, potentially extreme way. I think people really did go through a bit of a step-by-step process, like whether that be as simple as like a coach in your, sports team in high school, like, going to the weight room with them, with your team, and like having them teach you things, all the way up to like people in their 20s, having a partner who goes to the gym and then thinking, well, maybe I'll go and try it out one day and like see what it's like. And then that partner kind of tells them about the process and they learn and the process unfolds from there. So that was kind of how it like unfolded. And the themes kind of came right out from the data for the most part, and obviously through my interpretation of what people were telling me. But really this kind of idea of having some historical context as it relates to their body or pressures around body image or family history of engaging in these types of behaviors. A lot of people talked about like parents who were quite avid in, working out or sports or athletics, all the way to like, again, that initiation phase, like how people actually started, like what was the sort of initial catalyst or how did they get that initial information about what this process would look like, all the way to sort of, again, going through multiple phases, but this sort of beginner phase, which is kind of where you kind of become more preoccupied, you sort of start to maybe see some negative effects, like maybe there's some body dysmorphia, or like you just compare yourself more to people in the gym, so that maybe amplifies your behaviors a bit more. And then, like I mentioned, people went through various information gathering processes, like at multiple points, like after the beginner phase, like when they were trying to figure out what was the next step for them. That was oftentimes a point of information gathering because they were previously using like what their coach had told them or what their partner had told them, what their friend had told them. So then they found their own information. Again, they used lots of different sources to get that information. Mostly, I think, informal sources. And then really, I think the key point in the information gathering was actually like their own analysis of how they decided what to do and what not to do, which I thought was really interesting. People talked a lot about just kind of weighing the pros and cons. They talked about risks and benefits, like, is this a risky behavior and how much risk is it in relation to the potential benefits I might experience? A lot of people talked about cost. Like, is it cost effective for me to use creatine once a day based on the cost of like how much gains can I get from that versus like something else, for example? And then yeah, then they kind of moved into what I would call we call the preservation phase. I mean, they were kind of happy with where they were at. Like they might continue to try to build some more muscle, but generally they liked their body at the time. They were trying to sort of maintain generally what they felt was appropriate for their body. And then for some, not all, there was consideration, which I called the intensification phase, which they really thought about like intensifying their behaviors, right? Like they didn't feel comfortable anymore with just like that preservation. Like, you know what, actually I do really want to gain 10 more pounds of muscle, even though I'm really struggling. And so what do I need to do in order to get to that point? And so some people again, that was another phase of information gathering for a lot of people. Like, what do I do in order to make that happen? And again, some people talked about use of steroids. Some people talked about, just increasing the time commitment to it, even money, like hiring a coach, for example, or a trainer. So the intensification phase was kind of, okay, again, a little bit broad, but it was more just like, again, that intensification of behaviors. And yeah, I mean, I think going back to your question earlier, then I'll wrap up my long diatribe here, but is the kind of most underlying theme in all of this was this idea of balancing aesthetic, health, and functional goals. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, where typically people were trying to sort of balance those things, right? They really did have a desire to have a different aesthetic, like to fit a specific ideal. They also had health goals, like they thought it would help them in a positive way, whether it be like with longevity or reducing injuries in the future. Like I remember participants saying something like, I don't know if it's quoted in the actual manuscript, but said something like, when I'm older, I want to be able to like mow the lawn. And so like that kind of stuff, like people did think about like the future in their lives. And then yeah, like the functional aspects of it, right? Where they wanted to maybe feel like they could lift the groceries easier. And for some people, it was actually functional in the sense that they were interested in bodybuilding. And so they wanted to actually be able to compete if they wanted to at some point in the future. And so people were constantly sort of balancing those three goals that they had in relation to the different phases they were in. And again, those fluctuated and shifted throughout the process. Like, for example, people in the initiation phase, like typically were like, okay, I kind of want to, maybe change my body a little bit. There's more health focus, there's more functional focus. But as you got to like the preservation and maybe that intensification phase, like a lot of times the sort of health and functional aspects kind of dipped off and it was a bit more about, aesthetic, for example, or maybe it was about functional because they really wanted to gain more strength. And so that's kind of how they balanced those goals at that point. So yeah, that was kind of how the process unfolded. It was pretty interesting. And I think it provides an interesting framework for how we understand this.
Yeah. I'm really appreciative of like how you went about because I think it's like very interesting and kind of like reassuring like to me kind of like being in that age group of like people actually like looking at several resources to like see how to get to like the next part and like what they want to achieve rather than just kind of like blindly following as they see like some random person that they see like on social media or at the gym, for example. So
Yeah, I think typically most people are very sort of, this is an interesting group of people in that while they do potentially do some quote unquote risky things or things that we might think, identify as like out of the ordinary, they often are doing it with a very strong intent and with some type of information backing it, whether that be like bro science or whether it be like true science is debatable, obviously. But, typically they're pretty well informed for the most part. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of this group.
on that note, was there like anything that like really surprised you as you were going through, especially like coming in with some prior knowledge of this space?
And I mean, I think one of the things that surprised, I mean, it wasn't a whole, I think that the whole process was, I would say, surprising, really, to be able to just kind of visualize and outline this process. Obviously, it was, surprising and exciting in a lot of ways. I think some of the things that were, kind of most surprising was maybe just that, yeah, maybe that piece of how focused people were and, that they didn't do this stuff kind of just like pulling something out of a hat and just going for it. They did spend a fair amount of time, for the most part, like really thinking about this and really identifying what's the best step? What's the best workout for me? What's the best workout for my goals? Okay, what does it mean to do this? What does it mean to do that? And then, yeah, like I mentioned, kind of the decision making, like weighing the pros and cons within their specific lifestyle, with the pros and cons, the risk benefits, the cost, the goodness of fit. Like, like some people just said, like, I'm not going to be able to do A, B, and C because like I think one person said like they didn't like they had tried pre-workout and they were like everyone was telling me to do pre-workout and like I did it a couple times and I just felt like a jittery mess that I couldn't actually work out. Like it was too much caffeine and I was just like I wasn't actually able to work out. So now I just have a cup of coffee. So like just that nuance is actually really critical. And I think, again, it provides some information like from a clinical standpoint and a prevention standpoint of how could we intervene? How could we sort of support these people, make decisions that are best for them? Like for some people, yeah, maybe pre-workout is going to help them. And there is some research showing that use of pre-workout can be beneficial to gym performance, but maybe it's not a good fit for you, right? And so like, how do we find a good fit for you if you feel like, the only time you can work out is 6 a.m. before your classes or something, then you need to kind of wake up a bit more. Well, okay, maybe a cup of coffee is a different, potentially safer mechanism to do that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, okay, so I was also like curious about like the time independence that you mentioned about the process theory. So, because this is roughly of like the same age group, like same kind of like being able to spend a lot of time doing activity and such in their youth. So, was there like anything that you found that was like similar in terms of the time it took people usually like spent, like obviously these are like rough lines, but like within each phase or like moving to the each phase, like was there like a thing like like the 3 months or such to like get into the habit, or like 10,000 hours or something to like be good at something, and then they felt like okay, like I can keep going and do better.
Yeah, that's a good question. What I meant, I think what we mean by time independent is, yeah, that people could spend a year or more like in just that initiation phase, right? Or people could spend 3 months going from initiation to using steroids. You know what I mean? Like it was very like people spent the different amount of times in these different processes, based on their own kind of life situation and their goals and all that stuff. And then yeah, like how they weighed those aesthetic health and functional goals. So yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head like getting I don't think we collected information on like, oh, how long did you spend in this phase? How long did you spend in that phase? But in general, it was an evolution for most. They did all kind of go through some degree of this process. And like again, like no one just like wakes up one day and is like, I'm gonna take steroids. You know what I mean? Or like no one just wakes up one day and is like, I'm now like you have to in order to build muscle, you have to build muscle. You have to actually put the work in, right? And so there is a natural sort of progression that happens for many people. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't have the data on like the actual time frames that people were in these, but it was very dependent on each individual circumstance and the goals and sort of how they conceptualize this process for themselves.
And because
Yeah.
this research is obviously like very in line with your other social work, like outside of this research, has this like paper, like the responses and insights that you got from this, like has that affected like how you approach like other situations that you hear from like directly like one on one with other youth about their what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's definitely been sort of follow-up studies that I've done, not necessarily like maybe testing this or, like directly researching this, but researching different aspects of it. Like for example, after the study, we published a study on like information sources for young people on use of dietary supplements. So like, where do they actually get information on it? Like how much time do they spend sort of researching it? And where do they purchase it? Like things of that nature, like very much like nuanced details about how they kind of just experience their use of these dietary supplements. So like that's kind of along the lines of like the information gathering kind of process. And I've done research and writing around harm reduction techniques, which kind of gets at a lot of this process, right? Like, how do we reduce harm how for young people who, abstinence from steroid use or weight training in an intense way or supplement use is not a decision they're going to make. So how do we as clinicians, as health providers, actually reduce harm and identify people who might be quote unquote at greater risk for harm and mitigate those harms, like we've done some research around that. So and I think generally my my overarching kind of agenda is like further understanding muscle building behaviors among people and like how that is related to like muscle dysmorphia or body image issues or eating disorders or other problematic health and social issues. So like a lot of the work I do in some capacity stems a bit from kind of understanding this process for people.
So that like basically covered like a lot of the things that I found really interesting, like reading this paper, and it was obviously like really cool, especially as mentioned, like I'm in this age group, and it was cool to see like what other people are saying, and it was like very
Yeah.
reflective. I guess people are like talking about it, and it's like
Hmm.
yeah, this is generally true, and like what I've
Hmm.
heard from my peers as well.
Ah, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That's always a positive. That it holds up in real life, right? Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And
Thanks for having me. This is a good conversation. And yeah, like I said, I'm glad that, yeah, it's provided some language for for you and hopefully your peer group to be able to talk about this stuff.
so that concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Kyle. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look into his paper. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.